Hello and welcome everyone to the Solo Multimedia Podcast, where I give you my unfiltered take straight off the cuff. And today I'm going to be talking about the new Pup record, The Unraveling of Band. So, Pup are essentially a pop punk group who have been running for quite a while now. This is like their fourth record. They've got a decently broad set of influences, I would say, overall. They don't sound exactly like what you might expect a pop punk band to sound. Certainly not like one of the more sanitized ones, like Sum 41 or Blink 182. They largely go for a more rough around the edges punk rock, rawer, kind of like more organic sound, I guess, with maybe a touch of indie rock in there just for good measure, especially on the last record. And I was never like huge on them, honestly, but Morbid Stuff definitely turned me around on them, and I've gone back since and listened to the records before that and enjoyed them, but not really delved into them as much. So I'd really still say that Morbid Stuff is probably the only record that I truly love from this band. But obviously, with that being the last one, that led me to be reasonably excited about this new one. I thought, honestly, they would largely stick to their guns. I wasn't expecting any big changes, but I was hoping for just another hit of like summery punk rock tunes with a slightly rawer edge. And I guess you could say this is actually a bigger change than a lot of people may have expected, while also at the same time being weirdly like samey, which is interesting. So I guess the biggest change, I'll just address that first, is the production on this thing is far noisier, like far noisier than anything I've done before. I actually, midway through the second song, I had to go back to Morbid Stuff, interrupt the song and listen to the opening track just to check I wasn't losing my damn mind or my headphones were broke or something. It actually is quite a jarring shift, and it's quite funny because in the very first song, he references, just a kind of like, I don't want to say like pretentious sort of person, but those types of people you meet that maybe uni or whatever, where like they only listen to one very niche type of music. In this case, someone who listens to like a bunch of 80s noise rock and then never checks out anything new from that point on. Music is kind of solved for them, which is kind of funny considering the whole record then pivots slightly into a more noise rocky sound. But that's neither here nor there. Basically, that's the core sound that you can expect. Across this record, you're getting like really grungy, fuzzed out guitar riffs that are pretty maximalist for the most part. Much sharper sounding, more rough around the edges, like leads and kind of like panic chords, I guess you could almost say. Well, they're not exactly panic chords like you'd catch in mathcore, but you know what I mean, like sharper, more angular sounds. But like I said, they are largely sticking to their sound on this one. I guess you could just say there's not really much or as much of an indie rock influence. Maybe still in the vocals and whatnot. But yeah, that's like the core change. And I think that ultimately across this record, it serves as kind of like a double-edged sword. On one hand, the album definitely is... It's definitely incredibly amped, kind of like adrenaline pumping. But I guess on the other hand, it also leads to it feeling maybe a bit more one note than the previous record did, which is kind of unfortunate. So, kind of like, it's just kind of a double-edged sword. It is what it is, I guess. So I guess I'll just start going through songs. For the most part on this record, you're catching structurally a lot of what you'd expect from the other records. So like you've got some more punky, more aggressive songs. You've got some more ballady songs. You've got a couple like really slow tunes, some with like much bigger choruses that are designed for more of a summer audience, and there's a couple experiments here and there. Like there's a few more electronic sections, like the E-drums are featured a couple times across the record. There's also like saxophone and I think like trumpet and trombone, I think I read, although I couldn't tell you which is which. So there are a couple moments where they do experiment a little bit, but ultimately it's all in service of the core sound. It's not like they really ever go that far outside their comfort zone, except for maybe on like one track that pretty heavily features some electronic drums and it's on a ballad, so it gives it a slightly more different feel. But basically that's what you're getting. There's essentially 3 interludes. The first track is kind of an interlude, so all the interludes are called 4 chords, part 1, part 2, and part 3. And the first one, which opens the record, is like this largely piano-driven song. But on the very end, it's got a full band outro featuring a very noisy guitar solo. Then the very next song is probably the noisiest song the band have ever put together, at least that I've heard. The guitars on it just have this unbelievably grungy tone, and a lot of the leads are kind of implemented in a very noise rock way, especially with this like stabbing rhythm they use over the very first verse. The chorus is pretty like traditional for Pup, I guess you could say. It's not like, despite how aggressive the rest of the song is, the chorus is still something you would expect to hear, like, on like a festival field or whatever with a bunch of beers. But overall, I liked the song. It had a pretty simple structure, pretty standard for the band. It was like a very driving, amped up start to the record, solid tune. Yeah, enjoyed it. Then the next song is Robot Writes a Love Song. So this is a slower song with some electronic drums, although it's not the one I alluded to, because this one is largely what you would expect from the band, except for perhaps in the structure. This one is pretty almost structureless in a way. It just has kind of an interesting progression start to finish. It doesn't really have like a verse chorus structure that you would expect from a lot of this stuff, but it goes for multiple phases instead, and I like quite a lot of the elements on the songs. There's like strings, or what sounds like strings to me, in the back of one of the verses. The chorus has an almost arena rock feel, complete with like spaced out huge tom hits, but through this lens of like a harsher production. Overall, I can't say the song left like a huge impression on me, but this is the kind of song that I feel like I would enjoy more as I listen to the record more, but I guess we'll see. The next song, Matilda, is probably the most standard Pup song so far. Just lots of, upbeat, peppy guitar leads, lots of, again, summery kind of like, a very summery chorus. It's got kind of like a speedy rhythm with some like tight playing on the drums, lots of, like rhythmic interplay and that kind of thing. So it's just very standard what you would expect, just again, with that slightly noisier edge. Relentless didn't stick out to me honestly at all. I didn't really have many notes to make of it throughout. It just felt kind of like more of the same with a less standout chorus. And then we kind of get into what I feel like is the more experimental part of the record as we move on. So like everything there, with the exception of Writes a Love Song, is like largely what you would expect. Even Totally Fine, as noisy as it is, structurally is very similar to what you would expect from a Pup song. And also they've got other aggressive songs. This one's just a touch sharper, I guess you could say. But the next song after Relentless is, so there's a short interlude, which is much shorter than the first one actually. The first one's like 2 minutes, this one's 30 seconds. It's just another piano interlude. But the next song, Waiting, opens with this very like ultra fuzzed out, like aggressive riff. It almost sounds like the Pup equivalent of Hash Pipe from Weezer, where they try like almost like a metal sounding riff, and it goes over shockingly well. The only thing is that I feel like the summery chorus feels a little bit like it comes out of nowhere, especially on such an aggressive song. However, the song is still really fun because it has a ton of kind of like tight rhythmic variations on the riff and stuff like that. There's a chugged rendition that comes in on the verse riff as opposed to like the grungier opener. So yeah, overall, still a very, very decent song. I wish the chorus was maybe like a touch less summery, but it doesn't like destroy the song or anything. And I really do appreciate the tonal mix-up. The jam at the end before the final chorus also adds a lot to the tune. Yeah, solid progression, solid playing. Just maybe the choring was a little jarring on a first listen, but I feel like it's the kind of thing that, again, with more listens, will make a lot more sense. But hey, we'll see. Habits opens with, so the next song, Habits, opens with some electronic drums that are pretty noisy, and the lead guitar is almost disorienting from a moment, the way it's kind of like laid over the top. It sounds like it's going for one of those kind of like almost EDM break intros that you might catch on, like, I guess, even a Vane record, which is like a really weird thing to compare this to. That's kind of my only comparison point. It's delivered in a much more chaotic way, though, strangely enough. Not in what's being played, but again, it's just so maximalist on the production side that it is kind of like odd. But, you know, I didn't hate it by any stretch. And then after that, it breaks into a more ballad-like track, which I was kind of surprising. Now, when I say ballad, I don't mean like necessarily super quiet. It's more, I guess you could say, I hesitate to use the word power ballady, but I think if I say that, you know what I mean if you've listened to a lot of Pup's older stuff. But ultimately, other than that intro, I don't think there's anything super new here, but it does stand out in the track listing. One issue I had, though, is, so I do like the fact they're experimenting more with electronic additions, but at the midpoint, there's some sound. I don't know what it is. It sounds like an opened hi-hat hit, like when you kind of like open it, hit it, and then close it very quickly afterwards to create like a sound. Yeah, it sounds like an open hi-hat, but it sounds like an electronic rendition of it, but for whatever reason, it's mixed way too loud, and I just found it really weirdly distracting. So that was kind of unfortunate. But overall, I appreciate the intro. I'm glad they went for some different stuff on this track to give it a slightly different flavour in the back catalogue overall. Cutting Off the Corners was another slower tune. This one was definitely not a highlight for me. I just found it way too drab and lengthy for the amount of ideas it had, especially considering it really didn't bring anything new to the table. But that's okay. It's probably the only song that I would consider to be like a real dud, other than maybe like a Relentless. But then the next song kind of picks us right back up. So Grim Reaping opens with a really driving bass rhythm that the entire track builds off. It's a solid little aggressive track, but the production I feel like doesn't really suit this one quite as much. So I really just feel like ultimately there wasn't enough playing around with the textures and the different layers in what the guitar's doing, like on other moments on the record. So what happens is you've got this like more aggressive track that's still kind of like produced in a fuzzed out way, and it just doesn't end up punching as hard as it should. I like what I'm hearing, just perhaps not in the way it's executed. However, on the ending, there is a great section with a bunch of it's like either trombone or trumpets or something. I have no idea exactly what it was, but they sounded great. I really loved that addition. They're weirdly cleanly produced, kind of almost stuck out a little bit, but in it being so juxtaposed with something that's so harsh, it actually really worked, I thought. So yeah, that's whatever. Then, the next song is just a very short interlude, like 9 seconds. And the final track is, fortunately, another banger. So Pup the Band Inc. is filing for bankruptcy. This basically is a really spiteful punk rock rager with a ton of sarcastic lyrics featuring like a driving tom groove. So the whole thing's like quite deep and very like just lots of forward momentum, I guess you could say, like fast paced and that kind of thing. There's loads of like blaring guitars over the top of it as well. There's a freak out sax solo at the end that just works again shockingly well. It doesn't really have like a particularly summery chorus as well. So it keeps that kind of like spitey kind of, sarcastic edge all the way through, which I really appreciate. So it's a solid way to end the record. But yeah, overall, not, probably not as good as Morbid Stuff. Definitely a lot more spotty in my opinion, less consistent in the songwriting. I think there's going to be less here than I remember. However, the overall aesthetic and the direction they've chosen to go, I actually think works pretty well. And if they decide to go this way in the future, I think there's definitely a lot they can work on. The production, like I said, is a lot more maximalist for sure, and I can appreciate the noisy angle, but it's definitely not as well produced as a lot of noise rock, I don't think. And I don't mean in a well produced in the sense that like everything should be really punchy or something like that, but for what they were going for, it felt just like a tiny bit underbaked, like almost like it almost feels like a bit of a just like a fuck you in a sense, like not to anyone in particular, I guess, but just it almost feels like it's so raw and intentionally raw that it doesn't care about being maybe a little less as polished as it could be even for a noise rock record, which again gives it like a unique quality. And I don't necessarily hate that, to be honest. I actually think it works for the record in a way. However, it does mean that the record feels a bit more one note than it perhaps otherwise could have. Like especially on songs like Habits, where it's kind of going for a softer, more ballady type thing, but it's like still weirdly just loud at the same time, which is just kind of, I don't know, kind of strange to experience. But yeah, if this is an oddity in their catalogue, I think it's definitely one that's going to be worth visiting, way into the future. But at the same time, if they continue the sound, I think they could refine it into something really quite cool in the future. Overall, this record, definitely good, definitely a fun listen. I'm probably going to be listening to this over the course of the summer, almost without a shadow of a doubt, really. But nothing mind-blowing by any stretch. But yeah, those are pretty much my quick thoughts on it. Obviously, they could change, but if they do, I'll be making a video about halfway through the year where I talk about records that I massively changed my opinion on, because, the format is quite limited with it being a first impressions, like, one listen through, then give a raw reaction to kind of thing. So, if I do change my opinion on it, then it will show up at that point. But yeah, other than that, if you're a Pup fan, definitely check this one out. If you're not a Pup fan, maybe try Morbid Stuff first. I think it's a bit more approachable, I guess. Unless you're really into the noise rock stuff, then yeah, fuck it, go for this one, I suppose. But yeah, just listen, everyone. Hopefully see you in the future. And yeah, peace out, everybody. Bye.